So in the last segment, we introduced these four main views on the metaphysics of race, on what races are. And you may have noticed that the title is Race and Reference, and yet we haven't talked about reference or meaning at all. That will come later. That will come in the rejection of racial population naturalism, in the rejection of or in arguments related to racial constructionism, and in arguments for radical skepticism. Okay, so now let's look at the arguments for each position. In this segment, we're going to focus on racialism. So again, racialism holds that races exist and each corresponds to a distinct hidden structure. You can think of the idea like this. Just as all samples of water share one hidden structure, and all samples of alcohol share another hidden structure, so all members of one race share a hidden structure, and all members of another race share a different hidden structure. So the basic idea, again, is that just like water is distinct from alcohol because samples of water share a certain hidden structure and samples of alcohol share a different hidden structure, members of, say, the white race and the black race are different from one another in that each shares a distinct hidden structure. Remember that a hidden structure is an underlying structure that causes or grounds significant overlap in superficial properties and behavior of samples. So racialism implies the following: that just as the hidden structure of each sample of water dictates how it acts, and the hidden structure of each sample of alcohol dictates how it acts, so the hidden structure of each race group dictates how members of that group act. And so if we have two race groups X and Y, the hidden structure of X dictates how members of X act, and the hidden structure of Y dictates how members of Y act. So this is crucial to understanding the importance of racialism because the existence of these hidden structures will tell us something deep and important about members of relevant categories, if there are such hidden structures. Okay, so now we get the arguments. The argument against racialism, I should say. Here's premise one. If there are relevant hidden structures, then there are clusters of genes such that both of these conditions hold. First, members of race X share one cluster of genes, call that C1, and members of race Y share another cluster of genes, call that C2, and so on. And it's also the case that the genes shared by members of group X cause or ground psychological and behavioral characteristics that are distinctive of members of group X. And the genes shared by members of group 2 cause or ground psychological and behavioral characteristics that are distinctive of group 2, and so on. Now, this is a complex premise, and it's crucial that you understand it to understand the problem with racialism. So I'm just going to go through it again, and I want you to think carefully about what it means. You should note that I say it's definition in brackets afterwards. Remember, that means it's true by definition. It's a little bit quick to say that it's true by definition in this case. What I really mean is this. The following is true by definition. If there are relevant hidden structures, then members of one race group have one hidden structure, members of any distinct race group have a different hidden structure, and because members of the first race group have the hidden structure they have certain psychological and behavioral characteristics. And because members of the second race group have the hidden structure that they have distinct psychological and behavioral characteristics. That's true by definition, because that's just what hidden structures are, as applied to race groups. Now, the reason I say genes here in particular is because they're the only plausible candidate on the table for being a hidden structure. If we're not going to appeal to some sort of mysterious immaterial force that inhabits people of different, one force for people of one race group, another force for people of another race group, and so on, it's got to be in the genes. That's the best candidate. So let me say again what this claim means. If there are relevant hidden structures, that is, if there are hidden structures such that members of one race group have one and members of another race group have another, and not vice versa, it follows that members of, say, race group X have certain psychological and behavioral characteristics that are distinctive of being a member of X, and members of race group Y have certain psychological and behavioral characteristics that are distinctive of being a member of race group Y. So if one is true, if the consequent of one is true, so if the antecedent is true, so there are relevant hidden structures, and then we get the consequent, that's pretty significant because it means that races are really deep and important characteristics. and they'll be predictive. You'll be able to predict someone's behavior and psychology by pointing to their race. Okay, so that's premise one. Premise two just says there aren't any such genes. And I'll elaborate on that below, but notice that if there are no such genes, and the claim that there are relevant hidden structures implies that there are such genes, it follows that there aren't relevant hidden structures. So this is a straightforward argument against racialism. It says racialism implies that there are these hidden structures which have certain features, but in fact, there aren't relevant hidden structures. That's what the second premise says. So racialism is false. Okay, that's the basic argument here. And the key premise, of course, is number two, which says there are no genes that are shared by all and only members of each, one race group, and then a different gene that's shared by all and only members of another race group, and so on and so forth. And the question is, why should we say there are no such genes? Well, I'll tell you this first. Biologists largely agree that there aren't, but that doesn't give you much of a reason yet. So I want to look at that, help you understand why this is true. So suppose we compare 4 randomly selected people. We're going to take 2 from the same village in England and 2 from the same village in Sudan. When I typed in British-looking person into DuckDuckGo, the image on the left up there came up, those 2 people. And when I typed in British-looking person, Sudanese-looking person, the image on the right was among those that came up. It has more than 2 men, but 2 men is what is crucial because we're comparing 2 and 2. Okay, so we're going to compare 4 randomly selected people, and 2 of them are from the same village in England and 2 are from the same village in Sudan. And we're going to suppose further that the English people, the 2 on the left, can trace their ancestry back many generations, all living in that same village. And the people in the Sudan can do the same thing for their ancestry in their village. The point of this is just to say that the example it doesn't turn on the fact that some people from Sudan have moved to England and some people from England have moved to Sudan. We're supposing that these are like, English people through and through in the way that we would see them, and these are Sudanese people through and through in the way that we would see them. Well, even given these assumptions, you won't be able to predict which 2 people are most genetically similar. That is, you might think, given what we've said, that surely there's a high probability that the 2 Brits are more similar genetically than either Brit is to either Sudanese person, and the 2 Sudanese people are more similar genetically than either Sudanese person is to either Brit. But in fact, here's the claim, you can't make that prediction. Why not? Because within group genetic variation is massive. That is, the genetic variation between people who are typically marked as, say, black and people who are typically marked as, say, white, or even narrower, people who are British by short-term heritage and people who are African or Sudanese in particular by short-term heritage. The genetic variation within those groups is enormous. The genetic variation between the Sudanese and the Brits is comparatively small. Okay, so let's be clear about what this means. It doesn't mean that there aren't going to be any genes that are common to the 2 Brits that aren't common to the 2 Sudanese, or any values taken on by genes that are common to the 2 Brits that aren't common to the 2 Sudanese, or vice versa. It doesn't mean that. So to be clear, we may be able to identify some small number of genes that are more likely to be shared by the people from the same race. These will be things that control skin color, facial morphology, and so on. But that's all we'll be able to identify. And that's so few genes that it won't help us when predicting who's most similar overall. So here's a way to think about it. Suppose we have 4 people here, A to D. I made them green because I don't want you to be distracted by them being members of one race group or another. That's not the point. The race of these people is just beside the point, or the seeming race, or whatever you want to say. Here's the point. We give each of these people 1,000,000 marbles. Okay? A and B are given 2 green marbles each. C and D are given no green. C and D are given 2 blue marbles each, and A and B are given no blue. So here's what we know right now. A and B each have 2 green marbles. C and D don't have any. A and B have no blue marbles, but C and D each have one. Or sorry, each have 2. The rest of those marbles are given out randomly. So each person is going to have 1,000,000 marbles. And the colors will be sort of randomly selected. We can say maybe that there's 10 colors total that are being assigned. Or let's say 100 colors, whatever. Here's a question for you. Would you be willing to bet $100 that overall A and B have more marble colors in common than B and D do. That is that B is more similar to A than B is similar to D in terms of marbles that he or she has. Well, you shouldn't. Why not? Because A and B have 1,000,000 marbles, and C and D have 1,000,000 marbles, right? The random variation in the assignment of marbles by color is going to so overwhelm those two marbles that you know about that the random variation is what's going to determine overall similarity. It's not going to be determined or significantly impacted by the two that we've given out. Now, if you think of the analogy like this, the marbles, the green marbles that are given out control skin color and facial morphology, and the blue marbles assign different values for skin color and facial morphology. And the remaining marbles are responsible for other genetic traits. You can get the idea that even though there are some small number of predictable genes corresponding to race, the within group variation is going to be much, much greater than the between group variation. You're not going to get much predictive power about who's most similar to whom by pointing to genes. So again, this example shows why you won't be able to predict which two people are most genetically similar, even though we may identify a small number of genes that are more likely to be shared by the people from the same race. Again, we may be able to identify a small number of genes that are more likely to be shared by people from the same race, but that's it, just a small number. So if there are genes that constitute a hidden structure for each race, then either we haven't identified them despite the fact that we've been trying, or that very small number of genes that we already know control things like skin color and facial morphology also control significant psychological and behavioral characteristics. Well, that would be really bizarre. It would be really bizarre for a number of reasons. One is, if it were true, then there would be a small number of genes that's responsible for a wide range of significant psychological and behavioral characteristics, and we just have no reason to believe that that's true. Another reason it would be bizarre is the same exact genes that control something as relatively insignificant for survival as skin color would also be controlling something as relatively significant as psychological and behavioral characteristics. Well, that again is highly implausible, and there's no evidence for it. So there's no reason to believe that this is true. So if there are genes that constitute a hidden structure for each race, then we haven't identified them despite trying. Now, given some plausible auxiliary claims, this provides strong evidence for the claim that there are no such genes. So what are those auxiliary claims? Here's one. If we really try hard to find evidence for something, and we have no reason to believe that there's a principled barrier against us finding the evidence, then the absence of evidence is evidence of absence. Now, I'm phrasing it this way because there's a slogan that says absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. And taken just alone, that's true. Absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. That is, the failure to find evidence for some claim P isn't evidence that P is false. But if you try really hard to find evidence for claim P, and you have reason to believe that if there were evidence, that effort would bear fruit. That is, it would be sufficient to find the evidence. Then, when you fail to find the evidence, it is evidence against P. That's the auxiliary assumption here. And once you adopt that assumption, then the discussion that we've just gone through provides good evidence that there are no such genes. Okay, so let's put that back into the initial argument. The initial argument says that if racialism is true, then there are relevant hidden structures. That's true by definition. If there are relevant hidden structures, then there are clusters of genes or some other feature that's underlying, such that members of race group X share one cluster and members of race group Y share another cluster. And having that first cluster causes or grounds psychological and behavioral characteristics that are distinctive of X's, while having that other cluster grounds psychological and behavioral characteristics that are distinctive of Y's. But there's just no evidence that there are such genes, and given that we've been trying to find them, and there's no reason we wouldn't find them if there were such, that provides pretty strong reason to believe that there are no such genes. So it follows there aren't relevant hidden structures, so it follows racialism is false. Now there's a lot more to be said about the argument against racialism, but that's the basic idea that leads to the contemporary consensus among philosophers and scientists that racialism is false. Now, sometimes people in certain circles suggest that the falsity of racialism, or I should say the rejection of racialism by philosophers and scientists, is ideologically motivated or politically motivated. And while that may be true for some folk, it's not true, at least in my experience, for the overwhelming majority of scientists and philosophers. Instead, the overwhelming majority of scientists and philosophers are driven by considerations very similar to those we just ran through. So racialism is just bad science, the idea goes. It's not bad because it's politically pernicious. It's bad because it's false. Okay, so we're going to stop this segment there and continue next time by talking about population naturalism.